our second witness, Dr. Ashley South, as I said, a research fellow at Chiang Mai University in Thailand, who has observed and written on Myanmar a long time, and very much with the focus to include ethnic conflict and peace processes in Myanmar. Also forced migrations, politics of language and education, climate change. So Ashley South has recently published an article in the Irrawaddy, in which he urges the Thai government to change its policy on Myanmar. Also calling for the Thai government to resume a so-called buffer zone policy, which means that there would be an informal support to the so-called parastate entities under the authority of the ethnic armed organizations as border partners, because they indeed could assist in responding to health crises and cooperate in maintaining security. So I'd like now to invite Ashley South to take the floor. So welcome and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to address the inquiry. I think I should say at the offset that I do agree with the inquiry's premise that the international community's response to the coup in Myanmar has been inadequate. My presentation today will be a bit more explicitly political than you would expect from Amnesty International. I'm going to start by talking a little about the scale and the quality of resistance to the military coup. And then, if I may, I'll talk a little about the Thailand's Myanmar policy as per the article which you mentioned. And I'm privileged to be talking from Chiang Mai in northern Thailand. So I think the first thing is just to remind ourselves that following the bloody military crackdown to suppress resistance against a military coup, there is still 18 months later in almost every one of Myanmar's 320 townships organized armed resistance to the coup, broadly referred to as the People's Defence Forces, the PDFs, which I'm sure the inquiry has been hearing a lot about. And you'll know that some of the PDFs are working directly with the National Unity Government, others are operating more independently, and particularly in the southeast, in Kachin areas, and I know we will have a presentation on the situation in Chin State in the west later, working quite closely with ethnic armed organizations. So usually if I'm making a presentation about EAOs in Myanmar, I would need to take a bit of time sketching the history, and of course time is rather short today. But I would like to point out that the major EAOs I'm going to be referencing, so that's the Karen National Union, the Kachin Independence Organization, the Chin National Fronts, Karenni National Anti-Progressive Party, etc. Long-standing organizations with substantial political agendas and very high levels of political legitimacy in the communities they seek to represent. So then moving on, I think a year ago, there were widespread predictions, and I guess my assumption was that the PDFs at least would be quickly defeated by the Myanmar army. In fact, this is not the case at all. In many parts of the country, including places like Sagaing and Magway region, which have not been affected by armed conflict for many decades, not only have the anti-coup forces been able to hold on to territory, they've actually pushed the Myanmar army back in a number of cases. It's quite extraordinary. Looking for a moment at the ethnic armed organizations, there are hundreds of groups in Myanmar which might be defined as EAOs. Some of them are quite small, maybe more of an economic agenda. But there's a couple of dozen larger groups which control quite extensive territory in some cases and do provide services to the communities under their administration. So, for example, there are about 300,000 school children in Myanmar attending about 2,000 schools under the direct administration of EAOs. So EAOs are providing essential health and education services, and also in other sectors. So I think the first point I'd like to make is that this existing locally owned and delivered services require support, technical and financial support. I would like to go a bit further though and say that actually these EAO administrations constitute the building blocks of a new Myanmar. There's a lot of talk about federalism in Myanmar, and I don't really have time to get into that either. I've written quite a bit as an academic on the subject. But I would like to suggest that these health, education and other services protecting and providing essential services to civilians, locally owned and delivered, these can be seen as the building blocks of a new type of federalism in Myanmar from the bottom up, built on the existing services of EAOs. So what is the political significance? Well, it seems to me that very unlikely that Myanmar's citizens are going to give up their struggle against this vicious military regime. Also, I think it's unlikely that the Myanmar army will go back to the barracks, as has been demanded by so many different stakeholders. And I think the chances of any negotiation or any talks to settle the current conflicts maybe in the future could be viable, not right now. I do think there are opportunities for national reconciliation in Myanmar. You know, before the coup, the political reform process was stalling. The NLD government gave very little evidence of listening to the demands or aspirations of ethnic communities. The peace process was going backwards. Since the military takeover, we've seen a whole generation of urban-based young people, Gen Z often referred to as, who have fled to the ethnic areas and often made common cause with the ethnic armed organizations. So I think we're seeing a critical juncture in Myanmar when previously marginalized groups are re-emerging, and when the basic fault lines of Myanmar politics are really being renegotiated, often on the battlefield. So in that context, I think the second point I'd make is that it's essential that the international community does not jeopardize these moves towards national reconciliation by supporting sham elections next year. It seems that this is one of the main strategies of the SAC junta, is to hold elections without full and free participation on the part of all stakeholders, including ethnic communities, including the NUG. Any negotiations or any elections are likely to be at best a distraction and could actually serve to legitimize an illegal junta. So then, if I may, just a couple of minutes, turn briefly to Thailand, and respectfully, as I said, as a guest in the Kingdom of Thailand, I think we need to acknowledge that Thailand does have unique national security concerns in Myanmar. The Thailand-Myanmar border is 2,400 kilometers long, I think, including the maritime sections. Having said that, the SAC junta is just not a reliable security partner for Thailand. In fact, I would say that association with the SAC is embarrassing at best to Thailand and is really serving to undermine Thailand's credibility. So I would like to suggest, as Excellency, you mentioned in my article published a couple of days ago, that Thailand should reconsider the border zone policy, which served the country well for centuries. For hundreds of years, Thai security services have had relationships with border-based ethnic groups. Of course, that policy was replaced in the 1990s in the constructive engagement policy of ASEAN, arguably up until the coup. Despite what people like me might think, it kind of made sense for Bangkok to have state-to-state relationships with Naypyidaw. I mean, we're in a different world to the Cold War era when EAOs flourished. But I don't think that's the case any longer. I think Thailand needs to seriously consider re-examining its relationship with border-based groups. The ethnic armed organizations in border areas, just to take one example, the Karen National Union has 120 clinics, outpatient and inpatient departments in its areas under control, and has been doing a great deal to prevent the spread of COVID in border areas. I think by supporting responsible rights-based governance on the part of ethnic organizations in the border areas, Thailand can prevent cross-border issues, health, drugs, some elements of informal migration into the country by cooperating with authorities on the Myanmar side of the border. This is in Thailand's interest. It doesn't mean that Thailand has to change existing policies. I think that's not realistic. But I think sometimes it's more a case really of the Thai authorities looking the other way. We've already heard, and I would very much endorse Matthew's admiration for the local organizations that are providing aid in the borderlands. Certainly in Southeast Myanmar, in Kachin, the areas I know best, but I'm sure also in Chin and elsewhere, these CSOs have high levels of capacity. They are brave and principled young people. They can do the job. And at the moment, international funding is not short. I think middle to long term, that's more of an issue. But the main problem at the moment is that the CSOs who would like to provide humanitarian assistance are being blocked by the Thai military. So we know Thailand has a long-standing Buddhist humanitarian tradition. By supporting civilians in the border areas, I think this can really help to gain the trust and respect of a generation of Myanmar's brightest and best young people who will surely be running parts of the country in decades to come and can create a lot of goodwill for Thailand. I think more than that is required, though. So I know I'm at the edge of my time and beyond, but I would like to actually finish with the request to the previous speaker for voices from the borderlands. So I've made 2 trips into Karen State this year. I won't go into the details, but I went into the KNU 5th Brigade area, and I was able recently to speak to the Vice Chief of Staff of the Karen National Liberation Army, which I'm sure you all know is the armed wing of the KNU. And this is General Borjohay, Lieutenant General Borjohay. And he said, increased humanitarian aid to Karen civilians in the war zones is very welcome. This should be supplied by local organizations. However, humanitarian aid will not solve the problem. Only direct political and military support to the KNU and its allies will help us to protect civilians from the SAC junta and defeat the military regime. Having been in Burma recently and seen the terror created by airstrikes, I very much share the previous speaker's concern about the food crisis that's coming because villages are unable to plant their crops properly and look after their fields. I think the only way to prevent decades of suffering in Myanmar, to try and shore up some kind of minimum protection for civilians and some kind of rights-based governance, is by politically recognizing the ethnic armed organizations, which could take many forms. It doesn't necessarily have to be a formal diplomatic recognition, and by providing weapons to the forces in Myanmar that are defending civilians. I think what's particularly required is rifles and ammunition and ground-to-air missiles. I realize that this is an unusual request for an academic to make. I think there's a very strong humanitarian and political argument for providing it. Logistically, I don't think it's difficult, but of course, the politics are considerable, not least the geopolitical relations in this part of the world and the attitude which China might take towards supplying increased weapons to anti-government forces in Myanmar. But I think the clearest humanitarian solution is to provide weapons to the KNU and its allies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashley. There was a very interesting convergence between the 2 witnesses, you and Matthew, in terms of giving us this vivid picture of the new kind of solidarity and locally based action that, as you said, could serve as a basis for the new Myanmar, which of course we all would want to see, I believe, which has to be locally owned. So that we have to study more. And I would like to ask you about this, let's say you published article about the need to change the Thai approach. So what are the chances that this really will happen? And have you gotten some reactions to your proposals? So
thank you.
Secondly, I have a second question, because your presentation, like Matthew's, were very short but dense. So you also emphasized very much the need to engage the ethnic armed organizations. What, in your view, is then the best way for international actors to engage to the national unity government? And could you perhaps also give us some hint on the relations between the national unity government and these ethnic armed organizations? So 2 questions, and then I turn to my colleagues.
Thank you. Yes, so the first question, this is something of a new departure for me to write about Thailand Myanmar policy. I've written 4 books about Myanmar, or edited 2, written 2, journal articles, etc. I've always avoided commenting on Thailand's policy because I think Thailand does have uniquely difficult issues to deal with here, including the necessity for a pragmatic border policy, which I think those kind of constraints and realities are absent from most other international actors. And so I think we need to understand the reality that Thai security and political actors face. I did have a chance this morning to, I had a seminar with some of the younger Thai academics here in Chiang Mai, and that was really encouraging. A couple of them I met before, a couple were new to me, and I think the depth of knowledge and compassion among the Thai people I've spoken to about this is not surprising, but it is really impressive and it's quite inspiring. I understand that my article has been translated into Thai and shared with a couple of retired security actors. I honestly don't know the likelihood. I have that luxury of being a Westerner commenting on Myanmar. I work for myself mostly, so I can kind of say it like I see it. How realistic the policy is, I think the chances of Thailand officially changing its Myanmar policy, I wouldn't like to say. I think then we are caught up in national level politics, which Nitipon would know much better than me, and I wouldn't comment on. I'm not sure about the dynamics. But I think because of the need that the Thai military has for good information about what's happening in Myanmar, there is already a relationship between the Thai military, the special forces, the Thai intelligence services, and the EAOs. It's just that they are not given a great deal of support, but the relationships exist. So I think it's more a matter of building on existing relationships, sometimes turning a blind eye when relief supplies go across the border without having all of the right documentation. So more of a sort of informal approach. And then I guess the second question, of course, could be approached in a number of different ways. Personally, I'm an admirer of the National Unity Government. My take on federalism most recently outlined in an article published last December in Contemporary Southeast Asia from National University of Singapore, ICES, is this bottom-up approach based on the authority of EAOs. It's the EAOs that control territory on the ground. The NUG doesn't really control anything on the ground. I mean, it exists on the ground courtesy of the EAOs. So I do think the NUG has an important role to play. My personal view would be that's a relatively light coordination role. So a weak federal central government, that's the NUG, with state powers in Kachin, in Karen, etc., at present de facto under the authority of ethnic armed organizations, although of course part of what I'm suggesting is there needs to be a much more thorough process of ensuring that marginalized communities are included. Of course, it's not, no parts of Myanmar are ethnically homogenous, so we would need to look at the situation of minorities within minorities. There's a number of different factors. But I do see sovereignty as being with the EAOs. I would say that given the failure to build a state of Myanmar, I don't expect the state of Myanmar to really recover as a proper member of the international community in my lifetime. I think that's partly due to the impacts of climate change. I think Myanmar's probably an outlier that in the next decades we will see dozens of countries falling apart. Myanmar just has a particularly stupid and nasty military who have kick-started the process. But I think once climate change starts kicking in, then I don't really see the state recovering. And then I think the kind of sub-national authorities which already exist on the ground will be increasingly seen as quite viable because they're locally embedded. I mean, then I think it's a matter of maybe working with them to ensure food security and a number of other factors. But I think I'm slightly straying from the question. So the only other point I would maybe is, I'm sure you've already been in touch with some of those who are representing various stakeholders calling for an inclusive forum for humanitarian engagement. So I think the KNU, the KNPP, the CNF, these are all EAOs, and the National Unity Government Humanitarian Ministry have called for the creation of a body, which, of course, it's not for me to decide who would be on that, but I think we're probably looking at AHA, so that's ASEAN, UN, I know EU is interested in this, and other powers, the US, ideally China, maybe that's not so realistic, and then there is the question of what does this body do, of course. So we have already a humanitarian assessment, which I know Miss Adelina will talk about, which is being conducted through the SAC. There needs to be a parallel assessment. So the Karen National Union, the Kachin Independence Organization, they are undertaking their own humanitarian assessments at the moment. I think probably these assessments will be considerably more credible than anything produced by the junta. So the role of the Inclusive Forum would be to receive assessments, and who knows how many there might end up being, and then to try and support the findings and act upon the identified needs. The other call that's been made is for a Friends of Myanmar grouping at the UN, and presumably that would include a role for Myanmar's permanent representative to the UN, who at the moment is aligned with the NUG, as we know. I mean, that's obviously in play. So I would see the NUG as being the federal union authority, but a pretty light coordinating role, sovereignty lying with the ethnic states who came together to create Myanmar after World War II. I mean, they were forced into this sort of artificial structure by the British, my lot, after World War II with independence. There was a promise of an inclusive union. It never happened. So I think all bets are off, and sovereignty then devolves to the ethnic nations, which are the most coherent entities in Myanmar, and the only ones that are, in my opinion, likely to sort of get through this century. But Now I'm perhaps being a bit bombastic, so I better stop. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for very interesting proposals and the suggestions. So I would like to ask Nitipon Piwmow to take the floor.
Sawadee Matthew. Hello from Bangkok. Hello from Bangkok. Yeah, but my hometown is Chiang Mai. Hopefully to see you in Chiang Mai very soon. Yeah, I'm going to asking you for the same question as well. I have been speaking a lot. I mean, in terms of politics, and I have been speaking a lot about, this topic in the parliament, and still go on for sure for me. And I just would like to know that from, in terms of, in terms of your as a researcher, what is your opinion about the Thailand response? Under the general of the youth, yeah, that take any action. On the crisis of Myanmar right now. I will use this information to speak in the parliament within next week. Thank you.
I think as a guest in your wonderful country, I will resist the request to talk about individuals. I would say that historically, Thailand's response has been admirable. I'm from the UK, and we are trying to kick asylum seekers out of Britain and send them to Rwanda, which is a shameful policy. So there have been many episodes of forced refoulement from Thailand. Of course, including quite recently, and this is deeply problematic. I think we need to cut Thailand a bit of slack. If it's been 30 years now, first it was Laos, then it was Cambodia, then it was Burma, and then everything seemed to be okay in Myanmar, but now again, it's a real headache for the Thai authorities. So having said that, I think the response has not been very humane, and I believe it's not my expert field, but I think part of the problem is the militarization of the Thailand border areas. And so perhaps the civilian authorities, the Ministry of Interior, the Thai Red Cross and others have sometimes actually been obstructed from assisting refugees crossing from the war zones in Myanmar by the Thai military. I heard one very sad story of a refugee reception center waiting all day for the refugees to arrive. Thai Red Cross, Ministry of Interior, waiting with rice, with a medical checkup, with COVID tests. No one ever showed up because the Thai military pushed them back across the border a few hours later. They never made it beyond the riverbank, the refugees. So of course, it's a complicated picture. And for me, one of the things I struggle with, sir, is I spent a long time following Myanmar, so I kind of understand, I would say, some of the complexities. And I know the Thai state and security establishment is not homogenous, but I don't myself have the insights to know which bits are doing what. So I can see the result is not very fortunate. I suspect that there are elements within the Thai government and military who are quite sympathetic and who might be able to do more without necessarily a new formal policy, but maybe more of a sort of informal nod and yeah.
Thank you. And the next speaker will
sorry, just a bit more. Yeah,
okay,
yeah. I understand that maybe you not able to speak in more detail. Okay, I'm going to Chiang Mai maybe next week or the last, and maybe to meet you in person. And yeah, and sure. By the way, I'm going to Philippines next month with Chiang Mai University, and about the climate change, and also maybe we call.
Very interesting. Yeah, great.
Yeah, this topic later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure that personal meeting between the two of you will be very fruitful for our inquiry. But I would like to ask Mercy Barends, my colleague, to take the floor now.
Okay, thank you, Heidi. Thank you very much, Dr. Ashley South, for your explanations. Regarding the Thailand-Myanmar policy, I'm very sure that the Thailand government is very aware of the situation in the border areas. But so far, as we know that Thailand has not made many concrete or strong efforts. I'm sorry, Kun Nitipon.
I totally agree with you.
Yeah. Maybe Dr. Ashley can give some opinions. I don't know what is the real problem in these situations, whether it's because of the non-interference principles in Asian countries. The second, maybe because Thailand have the similar experience governed before for junta militaire, so they're very be careful when they take actions with the Myanmar, or because of the China strong position in the Mekong states. So maybe you can give your perspective in this situation, why Thailand is very low or didn't give strong position to help the people of Myanmar in the border area. And the last question is, as we know that as your explanation that in the border area, the territory is controlled by the EAOs. So what about the center of the Myanmar without the territory by the EAOs? Because we think that we have to support not in the borderline, but the people in all countries of the Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. So on the first question, I think already, Madame, you mentioned some of the factors, and yes, I think we know that of course the present government in Thailand came to power through a military coup, a much less violent military coup than the one in Myanmar, and I assume that Min Aung Hlaing expected to do a Thai-style coup, quote unquote, that maybe there would be some protest from students, some of the middle classes will be unhappy, people like me will make a fuss, but who cares? Fairly soon it will be back to normal. I assume that is the military coup which he sold to his senior officials, and clearly it's been a disaster, so I think he is massively miscalculated. But as to why Thailand's response, I assume it is partly because Thailand is run by a deep state which is highly dominated by the military, and so I think that would be a part of the explanation. And yeah, the second question is a big challenge, and I think it's a big hole in my argument, to be honest. I think you've identified one of the main problems in what I've been trying to present. My assumption is that central Myanmar may become quite a difficult place to live in the next 10 to 20 years. I think that the rice harvest is very likely to start failing. I think there are 50 to 60 million people in Bangladesh who will have nowhere to live in the next decade. They're going to be underwater. India's building a wall. I think we're going to see large-scale forced migration globally, and Myanmar particularly. So I think those central areas of Myanmar are in for a really tough time. But what is really so extraordinary and has certainly surprised me is that still in some of those central areas and quite extensive parts of particularly Sagaing and Magwe, but also places around in Taninthai in the far south, we do still have parts of the country which are not under junta control at all, where people's defense forces are active. Mostly this is a war zone, and I think Matthew gave us a very accurate description of the situation. I work with the Free Burma Rangers, so I spent most of Monday with the Free Burma Rangers getting a debrief myself on the situation in Karenni, and it is appalling. It's a war zone, and many civilians are being killed every day. But in some of these areas, in Sagaing and Magwe, the PDFs have set up basic administrations, health and education services. It's not on the same scale as the EAOs, but I think my argument is a bit weaker and perhaps really getting to the bounds of credibility here. But I do think it's worth examining whether these people's administrative bodies can likewise be regarded as local administrations. I think they have a lot more credibility and legitimacy than the junta. The question is whether they will be able to hold out for any period of time to make it really worth engaging with them and recognizing them as serious stakeholders and authorities. And I don't know, but I mean, if you'd asked me this time last year, I would have said they'll be gone in a year. There's no way that they could hold out against the Myanmar army in the lowlands. And yet, in many cases, they are still here, inflicting very significant damage on the Myanmar army. So I think that's one scenario and set of stakeholders to keep an eye out on anyway.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashley South. We have come to the end of your part in this hearing, and please don't hesitate to provide us with some more information and insights. We would definitely appreciate